Thank you so much. Thank you so much for spending your evening here with me. My talk is titled Navigating Development Financing in the Waning Cold War, India, World Bank, and Japan in Economic Liberalization 1981 to 1991. First of all, thank you so much for the flexibility. I was originally due to give this talk last July, but due to some emergency circumstances, the Modern Japanese History Workshop allowed me to reschedule. And I'd like to really thank Joelle for coordinating this series and getting me back on the speaker list. Thanks also to Anne May and Akari Morooka, the archivists at World Bank and Bank of Japan, respectively, who really helped me locate the materials I needed for this research project. By way of introduction, as Joelle said, I'm not ordinarily a development financing person. I work more on global health and drug control. I am working on a book right now with McGill Queens on WHO's role in international drug control, and that's the title there. But I came into this topic because as I was doing PhD fieldwork, I found some documents in World Bank archives that were very interesting, and they related to this critical period that I knew was still quite sensitive in contemporary Indian history. So I thought I should make sense of it. So as I was writing about AIDS and drug control, I was also trying to piece together this story, this critical moment. I have trialed this material in front of different audiences. I've presented it in April 2019 at the Political Studies Association with a development politics panel. I got to speak to Indrajit Roy and Diego Mayo-Irano, who are both experts on Indian politics. I also gave this paper in Japanese at the Japanese Association for South Asian Studies last October, where I got feedback from political scientists again, and broadly people who work in the social sciences in South Asia. So I'm really excited today to get some feedback from modern Japanese history experts. So if you have any comments on my interpretation or where I'm missing some key data sources, that would be fantastic. And that's just a photo of me on my way to World Bank Group archives in February 2017. I was in the middle of researching the Rockefeller Archive Center for my first paper on Indian AIDS NGOs. So just dipped out to do some development financing. So for today, I'd like to first give you a brief context and overview of the literature, as I'm aware not everybody will be familiar with India. Then I'd like to introduce the new data that I'm bringing to this topic. And then that should be number 3, but I'd like to discuss implications, future research, and take some questions and discussion from the audience. So clarifying some terms, when I say international development financing, I mean the sphere of activity wherein low interest loans are made available for non-commercial development project related purposes. Sorry, let me minimize so I can see. For non-commercial development related activities, such as building a dam or financing a balance of payments crisis. So that's the sphere of activity that I'm referring to. The time period that I'm looking at, 1981 to 1991, we can broadly characterize as coming after the end of the Bretton Woods system. So I'm sure you're aware, but in case you're not, after the end of the Second World War, we set up this international financial system, which would be governed by the International Monetary Fund. And that was originally based on the US dollar being the reserve currency backed by gold. But in 1973, with the Nixon shock, that changed to flexible or floating exchange rates. And the full implications of that, I don't think we fully teased out yet as development historians. The period that I'm looking at, 1981 to 1991, we might broadly characterize as the era of structural adjustment. This sounds really complicated, but it's not. It really just means when IMF or World Bank makes a project loan or a balance of payments support conditional upon the borrowing country adopting certain policies that would liberalize their economy. And as some of you might be familiar, this has been very controversial in the scholarship. So I'm just setting some terms of the period and the sphere of activity that I'm going to be talking about. As for the lending instruments that are available, I know they get thrown about a lot, so I just want to simplify. When I say IDA, I mean the International Development Association, which is a funding facility of World Bank that is meant for the poorest developing countries. It also tends to be given for social sector projects rather than more infrastructure or hard tech, hard industry projects. However, it has been so directed at India that it has been called the India Development Association. So that's IDA. We also have IBRD, or International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and that's for the more middle income graduated countries, the harder loan source that tends to give for more traditional development projects like dams, like agriculture, and more, I guess, what we associate with World Bank, I suppose, would be IBRD. And then IMF is separate from these World Bank group sources. IMF is the center of the world currencies, and it is the lender of last resort in balance of payments crises. So I'm sure you know all of this. I just want to set some of the ground rules for what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'd also like to set a bit of a scenario for the three key players that I'm talking about by the 1980s. So for those of you who are not familiar with India, India by the 1980s is in a very interesting place. It's an emerging economy, but it's also still got the majority of the world's poor. It's also facing a lot of political instability. So though India is known as a democracy, there was a concentrated period of state authoritarianism from 1975 to 1977 that kickstarts these cycles of political instability in the country, and that continues into the liberalization era. When it comes to development financing, though I said the International Development Association was so heavily focused on India that it was called the India Development Association, by the 1980s, this access is greatly reduced. And so India is forced to rely more on commercial lending. And the reason given is that India has been such a good borrower and has repaid the loans so consistently and so well, it does not deserve to be getting these very low interest, very concessional loan sources like IDA anymore. At the same time, India has been a country that's always been very sensitive to conditionality. So one of the cases brought up is this 1966 episode where food aid to India from the US and World Bank was tied to conditions like devaluing the rupee. And in India, that caused such a crisis, such a backlash, that it was known in the World Bank as the Indian lesson, as in let us never do that again in India. And that continues into the liberalization era. This is compounded by 1989 Narmada Dams controversy, wherein environmental movements and civil society movements start to get involved and say, you know, we shouldn't have World Bank projects here when they're displacing people with these commercial forestry or dam projects. So that's another thing to keep in mind in terms of the dynamics between India and World Bank. But finally, and something I think that doesn't get talked about in the literature, at least in critical development studies a lot, is that India has a very close relationship with World Bank. It's been said in the literature that the bank treats India with kid gloves, like very gently. And this is evidenced by a lot of Indian technocrats who do end up negotiating liberalization, having had long stints at IMF and very senior positions as well in IMF or IBRD. And the best work to look at that would be Jason Kirk's India and the World Bank. And he's a political scientist, but he's also done interviews, so very good source base. Now, when we come to the second player, which is World Bank, as you might imagine, after the Nixon shock and the switch to floating or flexible exchange rates, the World Bank is kind of struggling with its identity. What is it in this post-Bretton Woods era? Is it a mediator? Is it just a neutral lender or provider of funds? Or is it a policy advisor? Now, the events that are unfolding during the structural adjustment decade during the 1980s kind of forces the World Bank to do all of these things at once, and it's not entirely clear what is expected from it by different quarters of the international community. So just to cover again, structural adjustment, these policies were being enacted in Latin America in the early 1980s and in Africa in the mid 1980s. So the World Bank and the IMF are in a position where they're both responding to these crises, financial crises situations, at the same time that they're heavily bashed by a scholarly, but also an activist, a think tank-based community, especially in Britain, interestingly. And finally, because I do focus on global health, I'd just like to say that World Bank is also starting to lend in other areas, not just the traditional development projects, but also social sector and critically health and disease control. And one of the things it's doing is translating the structural adjustment, so SAP, structural adjustment programs, SAP's effects into other lending areas like the social sector and health. And I've got a paper on that in medical history called Disease in a Debt Crisis, if you're interested in that. The best works, I think, to look at this would be Jia Junzhu's Beyond US Hegemony in International Development, which is the first real history of the International Development Association. It's a really excellent work. Although she's an international relations scholar, she's looked at the IMF archives. So as a historian, I really, really appreciate that. And then Kapoor, Lewis, and Webb's Institutional History of the World Bank, its first half century, based on interviews that they themselves conducted, which I will talk a bit about later. And it's very, if you want to understand the World Bank, this is a great starting point. It is also a massive tome, so you might want to skip to the chapters that you're interested in. But finally, in terms of setting the scenes with the three key players, Japan has been less talked about and less understood in the literature. So let me just give you what we do know in both the English and Japanese language. And if I'm missing something, I'd really appreciate feedback from the audience. But broadly, in the post-war, with the end of the Second World War, Japan was in a period of reconstruction, but also making war reparations to East and Southeast Asian countries. By the early 60s, this shifts into development assistance, which Japan is kind of trying to find its identity as a development donor during this period. There are a lot of debates between the various ministries about what Japanese ODA should look like, what kinds of values it should be based on. But I would say broadly what distinguishes Japan from, I guess, the traditional Western donors is a focus on self-help. And regionally, the focus is on East and Southeast Asia. At the same time, there are, accusations of corruption in the way that Japanese ODA has been dispensed with the 1981 Philippines Marcos incident. Less talked about in the literature is Japan's engagement with World Bank. Now, there is a chapter on Japan in the World Bank, its first half century book that I just mentioned. So I guess that's a starting point. But other than that, there's not a whole lot of nuanced analyses of what exactly Japan is doing with World Bank, particularly as it starts to emerge as a creditor country and as a donor, especially in the 70s and really with force in the 1980s. So these are the works that I would recommend. There's a recent book out on Araki Mitsuya's Kokusai Kyoruku no Sengoshi. This is told as an oral history, but it's by the editor of the journal Kokusai Kaihatsu Journal. And it's a really great account, a firsthand account of what he saw as editor of this journal of how Japan's identity as an international aid donor and cooperator would look like after the post-war, after the Second World War defeat. We've also got a few kind of sporadic accounts by people like Robert Wade, who I believe worked in World Bank and saw this firsthand. And really what he's pointing out is that as Japan's increasing its funding and increasing its financial leverage, it is struggling to make a policy impact, I suppose. So the funding increase doesn't correspond with the level of policy influence that Japan feels it should have at fora like World Bank. And he says this is a matter of cultural clashes, but also about language barriers, which you might understand very well in the Modern Japanese History Workshop series. So I've given a snapshot of the three players. Let me just briefly go over the scholarship that I'm drawing from and the genres or the groups of scholars that I think are best to draw from in untangling this period. Development studies as a discipline, very interesting field. Some of you may be more familiar with it than others, but broadly what is argued in this field is that World Bank and the rich countries pressured developing countries to change their policies. And so it's kind of that kind of binary analysis, which is still important to do. It's just not the only field I would like to be drawing from. We also have Indian national policy analysis. So that's an actual genre that's quite popular in India, where popular anywhere, where former politicians or policymakers will write about their time. They'll write autobiographies about what they saw and what kind of decisions they made. You might argue they're trying to justify some things, but again, it's a genre that is important to examine. And it does relate to the third genre of scholarship that I'm drawing from, which is studies of Indian political economy. So development politics, development studies, also Indian political scientists, Pranav Bardhan, John Toy, Atul Kohli, many, many others, but they're very well read and very nuanced analyses of Indian politics, both at the federal and the state level, because that is something to keep in mind. India is a federally administered country. And finally, Japanese scholarship. Here I'm less well read in, so I'd love some feedback. But you kind of get more sporadic individual accounts, like the Mitsuya book that I just brought up. And so really, I think we need a lot more literature here. So maybe this will lead to contributing to that scholarship, both in English and Japanese. And that's just a screenshot on the right of the second type of scholarship that I'm drawing from, which is the autobiography of former Indian politicians. Bimal Jalan held a number of senior positions in World Bank before he was posted, I think, in the Finance Ministry of India. So moving on to my new data and what I'm bringing to this conversation, what I found in February 2017. So you first and foremost are the World Bank archival material. So World Bank, not IMF. I didn't go to the IMF, although it's in the same location. So it looks something like what you see on the top right, meetings between Indian Finance Ministry officials and bank management, IBRD bank management. And these names, some of you who are familiar with Indian politics, you might recognize them as some of the key players in negotiating India's liberalization. Also some correspondences. Indira Gandhi, this is from 1984, about IDA and how much IDA allocations India should get. Another source I've started to incorporate is Nikkei News. So Nikkei is Japan's business news, and I found it a very useful and very reliable resource in terms of understanding Japan-India economic relations. And you can see an example of the kinds of reporting that comes out. I haven't really read it against the grain as a historian. I've more read it for context, because I tried other news sources. I tried Times of India and I tried New York Times, but there just wasn't a solid story I could follow up on there. So I guess there were some other important things going on for those outlets during that period. So I use Nikkei News. I also draw a little bit from World Bank institutional oral histories. So for those of you who don't know, World Bank does run an oral history project, and it's, I think, quite underutilized. It's a very important source. So that book I mentioned, Bimal Jalan, let me just got back, this guy who's written about his time as a, as a policymaker, as a technocrat in India, is also giving interviews in his capacity as a former World Bank official, a World Bank associated individual. And look at the date, November 15th, 1991. So really just after liberalization. So these are important sources of data. And then I draw a little bit from JICA's library in Ichigaya, just a few sources. But really what I'm trying to do with this new material is to read Japan into existing narratives of India's liberalization. So using my new data, I've recategorized the period from 1981 to 1991 in this way into 4 key periods. Between 1981 and 1984, I think there's a decline in faith in development financing as a fora for talking about how developing country debt should be dealt with. Between 1984 and 1987, I think there's intensifying and diversifying India-Japan economic relations. And between 1987 and 1990, we see the increase in political turmoil in India really intensifying since the emergency, combined with the unresolved issue of commercial lending as an alternative to the decline in concessional loan sources that India faces by the 1980s. And then in 1991, that critical period, what actually happened? What was being negotiated by these 3 parties in the lead up to the July 1991 Declaration of Economic Liberalization? Now, in terms of time, I don't want to overstep, so I'm just going to talk mostly about that first period. I'm going to talk more about the first period of declining faith in development financing to kind of set the gears going. And I'll try and shorten the second and third periods to give you just what's most important for you to know, and then really focus on the negotiations in 1991. So declining faith in development financing. As I said in the background slide, India's links to concessional loan sources such as IDA were going down. So the shares that India was getting were decreasing from 40% to 15%, and that impacts a lot on the balance of payment scenario in a country country like India. So what happens is India, how do I explain? After Indira Gandhi's emergency, which I briefly mentioned, there's a period of rule by an alternate party, but that doesn't go well, and Indira comes back in 1981 with this new determination to negotiate with World Bank and negotiate with World Bank and donors on India's own terms. And this is best encapsulated by the 1981 IMF loan proposal, which was based on the 6th five-year plan. So, make sure that things are as much as possible dictated on India's terms. And in order to do that, some reforms were initiated preemptively, and Indira and the Congress administration made a great deal of effort to repay the loan early so that India would be looked upon favorably by the international community. It has been analyzed as a case of homegrown conditionality, so not the usual situation, the typical situation wherein the World Bank comes in and says, if you want an IMF loan, you're going to have to do these economic liberalization policy changes. And that kind of negotiation tactic just didn't work in India, didn't work in '66, and it's not working with the 1981 IMF loan. So that sets the scene for 1981. But at the same time, and I think this is what's not yet coming out in the literature, is that Japan as a creditor country is also starting to lose faith in the development financing model. So this is Japan's perspective on India's 1981 loan proposal that I just talked about, the homegrown conditionality with Indira's renewed assertive engagement tactic. Now, the US, for many different reasons, was opposed to this proposal. And Japan is watching these negotiations, and I think it's starting to understand or it's trying to figure out what India is trying to do, what non-oil exporting and yet significant economic or emerging economies like India, what kind of choices and policy options they have available to them. So as the Nikkei is reporting, for non-reserve currency countries like India that also do not have oil or significant oil exporting opportunities, the only choice they have is to eat into their own balance of payments situations in order to manage the turbulence that is caused in the 1980s. So my point here is that Japan is starting to lose faith in international development financing, wherein the World Bank is at the center. Now, developing country debt becomes a huge issue in the structural adjustment decade. And this is planned to be debated by the leading countries, by the G7 countries in various international fora, such as the G7 Williamsburg 1983 summit, and then the UNCTAD Belgrade conference in June that same year. But again, like I said, Japan's starting to watch these negotiations and think, is everything going okay? Are we actually going to talk about developing country debt? Because it looks as if it's going to be overtaken by Cold War East-West tensions. So as Japan is reporting on these supposedly developing country debt discussing international fora, actually the dialogue was taken over by, instead of North-South dialogue, it was taken over by East-West dialogue. So I'm trying to show, or I think I'm showing, that Japan's starting to lose faith in development financing centering on the World Bank, and it's trying to think, what do we do then? What is the way forward for developing country debt? Given the understandings of India's situation as a non-oil exporting yet significant economic presence. Now, India is doing things like reaching out bilaterally to Japan. So in 1983, the finance minister Pranab Mukherjee holds a press conference in New Delhi for Japanese journalists ahead of an official visit to Tokyo, and he's pushing for favorable loan terms and increased technical cooperation. And when asked by the Japanese journalist, why is it you're looking at Japan specifically, he says, well, it's the only Asian G7 country, and India is seeking society stabilizing technology investments. And for this reason, Mukherjee asks that Japan back India and the UNCTAD conference in Belgrade, where the dialogue was supposed to be focusing on developing country debt. So there are some bilateral negotiations happening, as well as the international multilateral fora regarding developing country debt. You can kind of see everyone testing out the boundaries of what's able to be discussed at different fora. But finally, India is also directly pushing its concerns to World Bank, specifically complaining about the low IDA volume. So as I said, there's a very close relationship with India and World Bank, and so those channels are still there. And even though IDA is declining, India's at least able to make those complaints directly to World Bank. And I think in the negotiations, which I'll just show now, there's some implicit leveraging of World Bank's prestige and World Bank's as a choice lending institution for countries of the global south, because keep in mind there are also competing multilateral development financing banks like Asian Development Bank that are coming up at this time. So there's competition everywhere. So the same finance minister, Pranab Mukherjee, writes to Alden Clausen, who is World Bank president at this time, in December 1983, I'm not aware how the South Asia division has assumed 11 billion of IDA allocations as an appropriate figure. The program of adjustment we've put in place and our development needs would fully justify a figure of 15 to 16 billion. So there's something being exchanged here. I think it's the prestige of World Bank in the global south, but certainly that revolving door I talked about earlier between India and World Bank is open enough for the finance minister to say, you need to increase our IDA allocations. Clausen does not acquiesce to this. There's a lot more going on in IDA that won't allow this to happen, but it shows the dynamics of the relationships between the three key players. So I just wanted to set the scene with that kind of first bit, 1981 to 1984. And I'll just gloss over what happens in the meantime between 1984 and 1990, right on the cusp of liberalization. So as I said, Japan and India are increasing economic relations during the 1980s. It isn't the first time that, Japan has had factories in India or some form of economic cooperation, but it does intensify during this decade. And what I want to stress is that it starts taking various shapes. So it's not just traditional ODA, it's also trade. So Indian companies ordering things like planetariums, actually, that was an order that was received, I found in the Nikkei, ordering planetariums from Japanese companies. That's one form. Another is joint ventures. Some of you may have heard of the Maruti Suzuki, a joint venture, which was such a huge success. It became a reference point for Japan-India productive economic relations. Technology transfer, as well as training fellowships. So for Indian engineers to come to Japan to train, but also most importantly, commercial lending. And I think this is really important to understand when I will talk about at the final part of the presentation on why Japan's involved at all in India's liberalization negotiations. And that is that Japanese banks, flush with cash, I'm guessing, are looking for places to put it. And there are these creative financial instruments that are created by Japanese private banks that start doing these loans, these yen loans to various entities in India. For instance, the 6 city banks in 1986 do this kind of joint $10 billion yen loan to Air India for purchasing aircraft. Presumably some kind of liberalization measures were done by the Indian government to allow this to happen. And this fits nicely with what has been said in the literature on declining IDA, declining concessional loan sources, meaning India must now turn to commercial loan sources. And Japan being a creditor country at this time, I think it wouldn't be a stretch to say that that's where the linkages and the interdependence and the risks are starting to happen between these two countries. And so in the Nikkei reports, you'll see throughout the late 80s, Japanese banks are starting to establish branches in Indian cities under strict supervision of the Indian government. However, the relationship is cooling by the 1980s. I think the reason is maybe some cultural clashes between the way Japanese countries want to operate and the kind of maybe cultural business that is in India at the time. It is a lot more like, how shall I say? It is a lot more invest now and the results will come later, which is very much kind of a tense thing for Japanese industry, some of you might imagine. So at the 1989, July 1989 New Delhi Japan-India Economic Committee meeting, Japanese industries were kind of tired of constantly being pressured to increase investment, increase cooperation. And they said, well, rather than progress dialogue based on confirming false friendliness, we should just hit each other with our real intentions, which is quite a moment for Japan-India economic relations right on the eve of liberalization. Now, let's not leave World Bank out, but really that stalemate, that kind of post-Bretton Woods, what do I do? What is my role here? That kind of identity crisis, I think, is evident in the way that World Bank is monitoring the situation in India. And as the balance of payments gets worse and worse, World Bank is observing this, bank management is observing this and saying, I do not believe that we can realistically expect to continue to lend to India forever. We're already straining our limits and our exposure guidelines. However, it's not like there are some, concrete policy actions proposed, because what is being said in these annual meetings is we should encourage India to not roll back on reforms previously taken and press ahead with reforms that can be undertaken without jeopardizing the budget or balance of payments. So I think you can see this kind of association with reforms and with lending that is just this mantra in the World Bank. And it's almost like it's not sure what to do, but it's sure that reforms will surely be the solve to the balance of payment situation. And finally, as I frame this talk as why did India have a relatively smooth liberalization transition at the same time that it had a political crisis? Yes, India does face a series of political crises from the mid-1980s to 1991. So in 1984, Indira Gandhi, a few years after she comes back to power, is assassinated, after which her son, Rajiv Gandhi, inherits the prime ministership. And almost immediately, he faces the Bhopal industrial gas crisis. India also faces a series of droughts throughout 1985 to 1987. There are also border conflicts with China and Pakistan. And then increasingly from 1981 to 1991, there are a series of power plays between the Indian National Congress, which is the dominant party until then, and the BJP, or the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the Hindu nationalist party. And you see, it's not really like outward confrontation so much as it's lots of coalition, lots of like alliances built between different factions, and that confuses the situation so that several prime ministers resign. For instance, VP Singh, who is the National Front prime minister, he resigns in November 1990, and then Chandrasekhar, not even a year later, in March 1991, resigns. So a lot of political instability going on. And then in May 1991, right as India's negotiating this balance of payment situation, Rajiv Gandhi is assassinated. And then we also have big world events that indirectly impact upon this. They're not immediately relevant, but I would like to recognize that these two events are what's going on behind the scenes. So the collapse of the Soviet Union from 1988 to 1991, and then the Gulf oil crisis, which raises oil prices in India, and that does impact on the balance of payment situation as well. So what actually happened in 1991? Well, let me give you an example account, and this is from that genre that I was talking about of Indian politicians writing autobiographies. Montek Singh Ahluwalia was with the Ministry of Finance during this period, and he's recently published Backstage, the story behind India's high growth years. And this is the account that comes out from this genre of scholarship. So Finance Minister Yashwant Sinha made a special effort to obtain bilateral assistance from Japan, and even visited Tokyo, but to no avail. I'm a little bit unsure on why this is being said, because my documents might present a different story. He also says the Bank of England and the Bank of Japan somewhat humiliatingly insisted that the gold pledged with them should be physically shipped to the Bank of England vaults in London. This is not, this I don't have a problem with. I'm a little concerned on the somewhat humiliatingly. I'm not sure why that's there. So again, I'm trying to piece together this story without contradicting, but also being sensitive to what information certain actors may have access to. So I think works like this are really important in that they show a firsthand account of what Indian technocrats did think and did plan for, and that they did plan for industrial reforms to take place before the balance of payments collapse in 1991. But I still think this is a story of liberalization that thinks this is a natural policy outcome of some hyper-rational decision-making, some very technocratic decision-making during a crisis. And I don't think that's the only way, that's the only reason why liberalization happened, or the only thing that explains how it happened. And the how it happened is where I'd like to make an intervention. So before the negotiations begin, in January 1991, India does draw from IMF's various facilities of 777 million, and then just over $1 billion. So about 1.8 billion is drawn from the IMF. In January 1991. However, by end of March, there's still 5.8 billion left to fund. So it was a really serious balance of payments crisis that the IMF institution could not fully meet. And so this is one of the reasons why you can't just tell the story as you can't just tell the story as India and the development financing institutions. So India realized that it would need support from friendly donors. And so Indian technocrats start visiting these friendly donors, such as Japan, starting in December 1990. Now, on the Japanese side, Rajiv's May assassination and the other forms of political instability made bond assessors very nervous. But because Japanese commercial lending was very exposed in India, I think that explains why Japan extended the assistance that it did in that critical period of April to May 1991, wherein the Japanese government offers fast dispersing funds channeled through various ODA projects in order to give India some breathing space, some leeway until a formal IMF program that ended up being signed in December 1991. So some breathing space. That was the Japanese government, what the Japanese government did. And so that's the empirical contribution I hope I'm making. And the reason why these fast dispersing loans needed to be channeled through the ODA projects, through IBRD and not through IMF is because the traditional process of IMF just takes too long. And the situation was so dire that India barely had a month of imports to finance the loans it had to pay off. That was the level of crisis that it was facing. So largely what Japan is doing throughout April to July, when liberalization is declared in 1991, is convincing World Bank to come along with it on that emergency financing package. So Japanese nationals such as Koji Kashiwaya, who is working in the World Bank's co-financing and financial advisory services, become this liaison between World Bank and the government of Japan to really convince World Bank, okay, we need to do something because otherwise it's going to be such a horrible situation. It's going to be so detrimental to the global economy that we should just do this short-term fast dispersing assistance. It would just be faster and easier and less painful for everyone in that way. So just a bit of background on this guy. Again, look at the date that the interview was conducted, right? Before liberalization is declared. He was apparently responsible for creating various financial innovations that the Ministry of Finance tried to do to transfer the current account surpluses that Japan had abroad. So initially, according to Kashiwaya, the Japanese government had contacted the US Treasury, specifically David Mulford and Charles Dallara, who are the architects of the Brady Plan in Latin America in the early 1980s, and asked, are you aware of what's happening in India, or do we have a plan? But clearly they had not been well informed of the financial crunch in India. So the government of Japan, via Kashiwaya, tries to convince World Bank that a fast dispersing emergency stabilization package was necessary to give a few months of breathing room. And so this is a map or a table of the emergency assistance that was proposed in April 1991. You can see that these are not, they're channeled through existing projects. They're how exactly they're chucked through, I'm not sure, but presumably it's done fast enough that it would give India the funds that would come in to pay off loans as they're coming in. I guess that's how much of a crisis situation it was. So OECF co-financed with ADB for an energy sector loan, OECF to Small Industries Development Bank of India, Bank of Japan, joint finance with Bank of England. And this one we know of. I just showed you the Ahluwalia book. He does talk about that. And then JEXIM, or Japan Export Import Bank, to Industrial Development Bank of India, 100 million, and also the promise by the government of Japan to encourage Japanese commercial banks not to withdraw deposits in India and to roll over short-term lending. So political oversight over commercial activity. And Kashiwaya related the Japanese government's condition, which is that India finally agree with the IMF and the World Bank on its own economic reforms. Okay, so I think that's really important to know when the conditions are happening and when the funds are being dispersed, because that does impact on our understanding of the politics of negotiating liberalization. And there's the archival source that comes from. Now, World Bank is hesitant. As I said, that kind of stalemate situation where it's like, the situation is dire, we shouldn't continue lending, but also I'm not sure what to do. That stalemate energy continues even as this crisis situation happens. So though the Japanese government invites World Bank to participate in these emergency assistance, it's nervous. It's like, I don't do lending to help repay loans without immediate guarantee of reforms. This goes against my core principles. You can see that kind of mindset of reforms, loans, reforms, lending being kind of cemented in the World Bank, and Japan kind of being like, we can't afford to do that right now. So implicit in Japan's invitation was that if World Bank, you'll come along with me, I will contribute more. And that's in a letter from Stern to Kanabo throughout April and May 1991. And you can see that because of India's extraordinary and immediate needs in the backdrop of the severe political instability caused by Rajiv Gandhi's May 1991 assassination, the bank is forced to think very carefully about its role as a development financing institution and about how the world deals with situations like balance of payments crises in all countries, really, but in the case brought up poignantly by India as a very important presence in the global economy at this time. So throughout May, Kashiwara tries to convince bank management, people like Qureshi and Karasmanoglu, that we should contribute even before the reforms are initiated because there's a political crisis. So reviewing India's negotiations with donors and commercial banks in the past, I'd like to emphasize 2 points. First, it's important for a country like India to have a well-established relationship with donors, just in case there are future financial crises. And second, international financial institutions, donors or creditor banks, as well as indebted debtors, may not be fully aware of the costs of these financial crunches and thus are complacent in using or developing various fora or facilities to prevent them. So as I showed very early in the presentation, Japan was losing faith in these fora about talking really seriously about developing country debt, about talking about global debt, because it gets taken over by Cold War politics. So it's forced to make these dialogues happen in these emergency situations. The World Bank continues to be hesitant. I hope we would not be swayed by that argument, because we are not in favor of giving loans when there are no promises of reforms. Given the need for major structural changes, it would be a mistake to proceed on this line of argument. Absolutely fundamental that large-scale lending, including adjustment loans, be based firmly on a comprehensive and consistent domestic reform package. Again, still that hesitancy. To which Kashiwara responds, we should take into account the implications of the Indian financial crunch on the general behavior of the international markets towards least developed country financing and the current financial systems, including the role of international financing institutions. We sometimes have to use brinkmanship in our negotiations with debtors on policy reforms, the traditional structural adjustment policies that we have done in Latin America, Africa in the early mid-1980s. But if the debtor cannot commit to anything during an election period or during political turmoil, such as assassination, but is strongly motivated to recover from difficulties, we should consider the political limits and be practical in assessing the real cost of the financial crunch without our assistance. I believe the bank can make a strong case to render emergency assistance. So by early June, bank management agrees, even though India had not yet enacted the usual across all sectors liberalization measures that other countries had been forced to do. And that's in a letter in late June between Qureshi and Baijal. Within World Bank management, and specifically funds would be distributed through a Bombay gas flaring reduction project. And this is because of the Gulf oil crisis, hiking up oil costs, and energy costs are one of the most expensive costs that countries face in terms of imports. But the bank would only agree to do this if the Japanese government would promise to co-finance, and government of India prepared itself for liberalization on 3 fronts: stabilization, modest structural adjustment action, and mobilization of gold reserves. And this is from the actual project, that project from May, the gas flaring reduction project, which proves that, yes, it was the gas flaring reduction project because that is what is most expensive, is energy. And now combined with the other fast dispersing loans, this would give 2 to 3 months of breathing space until India got its domestic politics under control and a more orderly IMF program that was just necessary at this point. That could take place, and it eventually did in December that year. And then by late June 1991, with Narasimha Rao's government, the Congress government back in power, stabilizing the situation, there was an agreement to devalue the rupee in early July. And the new finance minister, Manmohan Singh, who is greatly credited with communicating the reforms that were agreed on with external parties into putting that into domestic policy, putting that into domestic legislation. And he declares this with the July 1991, the famous 24 July budget speech. And that's an image from his budget speech on where this financing will be allocated. He also writes to Barbara Conable, the new bank president, in July 1991, our Prime Minister, Narasimha Rao, has mentioned his firm resolve to adopt the determined measures to improve our balance of payments situation, undertake meaningful structural reforms. I am confident that when I present my budget on 24th July 1991, I will be able to convince the world public opinion that India has an effective strategy and a credible program of growth-oriented adjustment and an adjustment package with a human face, a package which will bring credit both to our friends abroad and to the people of India. And then the IMF loan, or the World Bank Structural Adjustment Loan, is signed on December 1991, and that kickstarts the era of liberalization in India. So to conclude, I think there are many directions that I could take this research, but really I just want to reflect on why this story matters, whose story it is, and what it means methodologically. So first, in terms of the three parties that I've been talking about, World Bank, IMF, is it going to be continue to be the center of international development financing? I think the India case is going to contribute to our knowledge or our predictions on where the center of development financing will be, or whether there will be many centers. And for Japan, the new actor that I've read into this story, is it acting in principle, or is it just reacting, or is it saving face? Does Japan, as a creditor country, have a plan or have a vision for what sustainable global development financing should look like, using the case of India? Or is it just like, well, our commercial banks are exposed, we're just gonna have to make sure that, we don't, have some backlash like we did with the 1989 Marcos incident. Interestingly, I've been suggested by some people that there might be a link with the 1991 asset bubble crash in Japan. So that I'm still working on. I haven't made any links there, but that's definitely an interesting idea to keep in mind. And for India, is it just trying to stay afloat, or does it have a strategy for actual emergence as a major economic player and a major responsible player in the global economy from the 1990s onwards? I have submitted this in paper format to a few journals, which haven't been accepted yet, but I've had some really productive feedback. In the papers, I've tried to argue this argument. Indian leaders understood the global economic situation and navigated as best they could to have a relatively smooth liberalization transition. However, I think this didn't quite ring true with the, I'm guessing, economic policy experts, Indian economic policy experts, that said that I need to understand the discussions between the Indian government and the IMF especially. I need to understand that better, bring that in better. And I should use domestic Indian materials as well. In other words, combine the domestic and the international story and don't overstress the role of Japan, which is definitely a point to make because I did draw a lot from Japanese materials. And overall, the usual, less description, more analysis, although they did acknowledge that the empirical material that was brought out was new. So that's, I guess, helpful advice for me as I try and turn this into something publishable. I am researching this story currently, so I've got some materials from the Bank of Japan. You can see on both flanks from 1989 and 1978, these documents which are observing the situation really in India. Doesn't really add a whole lot to what I had from the Nikkei, but it's certainly interesting to know that the Bank of Japan was observing this situation. Although I do have to say it's largely the same as World Bank. It's kind of like, this is happening, what do I do? So it kind of reinforces the idea that banks are just banks. They're not really policy directing bodies. I am due to look at some Ministry of Foreign Affairs materials, and you can see the list of some of the documents there. What exactly they'll contribute, I'm not yet sure. I've not researched MOFA archives yet. And I am overall trying to figure out the chain of command between these various Japanese bureaucracies and their relationships with commercial banks and their relationships with Japanese industries and ODA. I'm not sure exactly what the sociology of bureaucracy is in Japan. Who knows what, who has the power, who has the mandate to act. But I guess I'll leave this with, is this a story about Japan, or is it a bigger story about the futures of sustainable global financing? And that's a question that I'm trying to work through with my new materials. There are similar research projects ongoing, most notably Professor Yago Kazuhiko at Waseda, who is in the Commerce Department, and he has a wonderful project on global indebtedness funded by JSPS that is, I think, just starting. And then, of course, Professor Akita Shigeru, who is an expert on Indian economic history, and he has a paper out on the skills with which Indian policymakers negotiated with World Bank and the Aid India Consortium in particular. And he's got a project that I think is coming to the tail end of its life cycle, World History After the Oil Shocks. But if you have any suggestions on interpretations or more archives I should look at, or where I should publish, how I should publish this as a paper, as a book, or if I need more research, if I need to work with more people, that would be really, really fantastic. But INSA, my paper today, has used World Bank archival material and Nikkei reports to read Japan into India's liberalization story as a key player from 1981 to 1991. And the key takeaway messages are to envision and create a sustainable future global financial system or systems, and to which historians can contribute analyses based on rich gray literature archival documents that show the perspective of all the major stakeholders. And I think it's important for historians to explain global debt crises as more than a zero-sum game, but as a much more complex story about different historical actors with different agendas, but most importantly, different levels of access to information leading to different interpretations and different actions and different outcomes. So thank you so much for your time today. I can be reached at these via these social media venues. So hope to hear from you soon. And I'm ready to take some questions and discussion. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Reiko. So Q&A is open. Please feel free to direct questions, suggestions, comments to Dr. Kanazawa.
May I ask a question? I'm Michael Ikeo. I work for Waseda University Faculty of Commerce. So I'm a colleague of Kazuhiko Yago. Yeah, he's he's a very good researcher and professor. He has been working on the international economic institutions, and also yeah. And I have been, I'm a historian of economics and historian of recent, I'm working on recent history. And so, you worked a lot. So yeah, a lot of archives, governments and international institutions. And but just recently, Asian Development Bank published this book, Asia's Journey to Prosperity. It should be very useful. ADB celebrated the 50th anniversary a couple of years ago, and according to the book, ADB financing increased in the 1990s. So, something happened probably in 1990 or 1991. And so relating the event of 1990 or 1991, have you looked at the John Williamson's paper on kind of Washington consensus, So, so he has been working on Latin America. So he usually focuses on Latin American economy and Americans aid to Latin America. So he wrote a paper on how to, how to give aid to Latin American countries. However, other scholars and policy analysts used, Williamson's paper and sometimes quote, sometimes his proposal was regarded as, Washington consensus or market fundamentalism. So many, this, so like, so yes, yeah, but so so many, discuss so yeah, some scholars ignored Williamson's protest. Yeah, just he focused on Latin America, and but so it's kind of red herring, So, however, so listening to your presentation, other governments and international institutions used, Williamson's idea to, other regions. Yes. So yeah, so this is the my advice, and also, yeah, both Iago and Akita, member of, Socio-Economic Association of Japan. So, yeah, why don't you, present the paper to the annual conference of the society? Okay.
Thank you. I found it really interesting that a 1991 paper that is being authored at the same time that this is happening is being then subsequently used by policymakers as
yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Really
so
yeah,
I put that information in the chat box. So what Washington means by policy reform, what that was published in 1990, and he, Williamson gave a speech in, Spain or somewhere in Europe. Yeah, this is a part of his book, or his edited book, so, so his paper has been very influential, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and just you can, Google the title, what Washington means by policy reform. Yeah. So now this paper is, uploaded on the, some think tank, probably, Peterson Institute of International Economics or something. Yeah.
Okay. I'll definitely check it out. Thank you.
Welcome. Yeah. Maybe. Next. Okay.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, I guess, are there other questions?
Hmm?
May I ask a question, Kanazawa Sensei?
Hi.
Is that okay if I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, Reiko, thank you so much for talking about such an important topic, such a topic that's under-researched and really deserves much more attention. I think you covered a real lot of ground in your presentation, but just to focus in the middle of June 1991, it's my understanding that the Indian government was only 3 days away from defaulting on international loans. And it was certainly like a period where their international reserves were only sufficient for about 2 weeks. So it really was a critical time. You must remember for Japan too, the bubble had finished. It was a critical time for the Bank of Japan as well. But my question is, can you talk a little bit more about the sudden depreciation of the rupee and the IMF and World Bank's role in that? Given that Japan, just 5 years earlier, Japan was told, you are the problem. The yen is too high. You know, the yen is too low. The yen must appreciate. But then when it came to India, just 5 years later, they were saying, no, the yen must, the rupee must depreciate. So can you talk a little bit more about this IMF World Bank induction of a weak rupee?
I might not even understand the premise of your question because I'm not an economist.
But talking about June 1991 in India, yeah, and the World Bank, and maybe could you talk more about the structural adjustment loan that was decided upon in December? Because it seems like that loan, although we typically say, oh, it's December 1991, actually the negotiations were taking right place from April. You know, it was like can you talk more about the structural adjustment loans of 1991?
I need to research it. I need to look at the IMF program because this is as far as I've gotten. But so the December 1991 IMF and World Bank program, what exactly the terms were, I don't know, and I need to know that. So that's really, really helpful. I've kind of had trouble linking this to actual outcomes because it's gray literature. I don't exactly know what led to what. Like, I don't know if, so for this slide on the emergency assistance package, I'm sure something like that happened. I don't know if this is the exact amount. But I didn't even think to, like, all I know is that everything came together in December 1991. So I need to really look at that. So that's a good suggestion for next research.
Okay, if you can flash up your email address again, and I've written a little bit about this, and I can send material to you. And
that would be fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your research.
I think it's also like productive dialogue between economic history, because I'm not in economic history, so I don't understand. All I know is that somebody was upset. Then I follow that trail archivally. So, well,
you know, it's really important in Indian history because the BJP gets started in the middle of this turmoil, right? You know, as Congress I is dissolving, the BJP is starting. So, you know, for Indians, this is a really important period, and you've identified it. So that's great. Yeah, 1991, right in the middle of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess the
Thank you very much.
Coalesces in 1991. Yeah. And in some ways it might be too narrow to have lots of feedback on, because it's it's one of those topics that's quite, you know, who did what at what time. It gets very bureaucratic in terms of time, but it is, I think, important for someone to do it. So yeah, if you have any suggestions on or archives.
I mean, maybe if I can like follow up with a completely non-specialist question. So like, you know, if you're not quite sure about, you know, the economic history of what's going on, maybe from like the development side, which is right, something that's more familiar. And I imagine this probably ties in as well to, what is it, the Journal of Development Studies response, right? They're kind of not so interested in what role Japan plays. Like that's the thing that they want downplayed. So maybe, I don't know, perhaps you covered, there's so much information, but which was great. But I wonder if, does Japan play a particularly, like, how does it compare with the other kind of lenders to India around this time? Are the terms different for it? Does it have a particularly significant or perhaps insignificant contribution? I mean, I'm not, if you could give us a bit bigger picture of, lenders going into India at this time.
By 1989, Japan is India's largest ODA partner. That's ODA. So, more development focused economic interaction. But Japanese industries, I don't think, are ever as comfortable as Maruti Suzuki in 1982. Mm-hmm. So I think Maruti Suzuki is the high point. But after that, there's just so much business culture differences that I think I've seen it said in the Nikkei reports that it just doesn't work. 1985 kind of was the high point, and after that, Japanese industries retreat into Southeast Asia more, where it's just easier.
I mean, also you mentioned at the end that you're trying to go for perhaps an account that has more complexity, more actors, or more attention to different actors. I know you're still kind of like feeling out the different archives, but especially since you mentioned that, at some point, is it commercial lending is the biggest kind of efforts that Japan puts towards India. Have you thought of, I don't know, or to get a sense of other perhaps companies or other actors involved in, this commercial lending efforts to India outside of like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? Or
yeah, maybe interviews would be good. I'm not sure. I would. That's a really important thing because I just said commercial lending. So what exactly was being done?
Yeah, or what kind of companies were involved in this? I mean,
yeah,
I know how difficult it is. You mentioned, you're looking at it through Nikkei and these other materials, so it's hard to get a concrete, comprehensive look.
But if I just get one example of a weird financial instrument that was created by some overenthusiastic Japanese banks, I think I'll get sort of the picture. And that's a really good comment. Actually, it's getting my brain going. And like, maybe I'll just ask, or I could interview someone and say, well, when did you start? When did this relationship with India begin? And why did no one stop you? That's really helpful. Thank you. Well, thank you. I really appreciate. I know I've just like launched a bunch of information at my audience, so I appreciate you listening. And if you have any advice or some people I could link with, that's my email there, Kanazawa, gsid@nagoya.ac.jp. I think that's all from me.